The lights came on at the Riviera Hotel and Casino on December 10, 1957, and for one night, Havana became the most glamorous city in the Western Hemisphere. The chandeliers alone cost more than most men earned in a decade. The carpets ran from the entrance to the gaming floor in deep burgundy, uninterrupted, as though the building had been designed to pull you forward without your noticing. The dealers wore pressed white shirts and moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained to make losing feel like a reasonable thing to do. Outside, the Malecon curved along the waterfront in the warm December air, and the city glittered, and the guests arrived in cars that matched the occasion. Meyer Lansky stood at the edge of the casino floor that night and did not gamble. He never gambled. That was, in its way, the most important thing about him. But the money was only part of what Lansky had built in Cuba. The rest of it was invisible, which was precisely the point. Havana had not happened by accident. Nothing in Meyer Lansky's life happened by accident. The relationship that made the Riviera possible had begun nearly 2 decades earlier, in the late 1930s, when Lansky first traveled to Cuba and recognized something that most visitors did not. They saw an island. He saw a jurisdiction, a place where the gap between what the law said and what the government did was wide enough to build something permanent, if you found the right person to build it with. That person was Fulgencio Batista. Batista was then a colonel, later a president, eventually a dictator. A man whose relationship with power was transactional in the most efficient possible sense. He did not particularly care how money was made. He cared about receiving a reliable portion of it. Lansky understood this immediately, because he had spent his entire adult life in rooms full of men whose relationship with power was transactional, and he had learned to read them with the same speed and accuracy he applied to columns of figures. The arrangement they reached was simple in outline and elegant in execution. Lansky would modernize Cuba's casino industry, bring in trained staff, updated equipment, the operational discipline that turned a gambling room into a machine that produced consistent returns. Batista would provide political protection, favorable licensing, and the kind of institutional blindness that money tends to purchase in governments willing to sell it. What followed was not merely a business relationship. It was a 20-year construction project. Through the 1940s, Lansky worked the Havana casino circuit with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the foundations mattered more than the visible structure. He established relationships with Cuban officials at every level. He developed supply chains for equipment that bypassed the complications of local procurement. He built management systems that could produce reliable results across multiple properties simultaneously. The Hotel Nacional came first, where Lansky installed modern casino operations that transformed the property from a pleasant hotel into a destination in its own right. Then came a series of other properties, each building on the organizational knowledge accumulated in the previous one, each generating cash in volumes that required, as Lansky understood better than anyone, not just collection but active management. Because the money was the other thing. The money was always the other thing. The cash that flowed through the Havana casinos did not simply accumulate. It moved. Lansky had developed, across decades of operation, a financial architecture of considerable sophistication. A layered system of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and carefully chosen jurisdictions that allowed money to travel from the point of generation to a state of effective invisibility. Cuba was the crown jewel of that architecture, not because it generated the most money, though it generated enormous amounts, but because its combination of political protection, geographic positioning, and institutional cooperation made it the most stable node in a network that was always, by design, in motion. And then he built the Riviera. $14 million. His own money, drawn from sources that no investigator ever successfully traced to their origin. The project took 2 years and consumed his attention in ways that suggested something beyond the financial. Lansky supervised the construction with the focus of a man who understood that the building itself was making an argument. That luxury, delivered with precision and consistency, was a business model as reliable as any other and more defensible than most. The Riviera opened with 9 floors, 211 rooms, and a casino floor that set a standard for the region. Ginger Rogers performed at the opening. The guests included American industrialists, Cuban elite, and European tourists. It was, by any measure, a triumph. Lansky watched it from the edge of the floor and did not gamble. He calculated. What he was calculating, among other things, was time. The operation was running. The money was moving. Batista was stable, or appeared stable, which in political terms is not the same thing, though the difference is often only visible in retrospect. But Cuba in 1957 was not the Cuba of 1940. Something had changed in the air of the island. A tension that the casino guests, wrapped in the Riviera's careful luxury, might not have noticed, but that anyone paying attention to the country rather than the casino could feel. In the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, a bearded lawyer from a wealthy family had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Batista government for over a year. His name was Fidel Castro. His movement was growing in ways that Batista's intelligence apparatus was either unable or unwilling to accurately report to the man at the top. Lansky was not a political analyst, but he was a man who had spent his entire life assessing risk, and the risk assessment on Cuba had been shifting for months. He stayed. The operation was too valuable to abandon on instinct, and the instinct might be wrong. Batista had survived challenges before. The Riviera's first year of operation was, by financial measures, exceptional. On the evening of December 31, 1958, the casino floors across Havana were full. The guests at the Riviera were celebrating the new year with the particular enthusiasm of people who have traveled to a foreign country specifically to enjoy themselves and have found the experience meeting their expectations. The dealers moved with their trained efficiency. The chips moved. The money moved. In the Sierra Maestra, Fidel Castro's forces were moving too, faster than anyone in the Havana casinos knew. The news arrived the way catastrophic news tends to arrive, not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a series of signals that, taken together, meant something irreversible had happened. Batista had fled the country. The military had collapsed. The revolutionary forces were entering the cities. Havana itself would fall within hours. The casino floors did not empty immediately. There was a period. Minutes or hours. Accounts differ. When the games continued and the guests kept playing, because the human capacity to ignore incoming information that disrupts a pleasant experience is considerable, then the picture became clear. And the floors emptied. Meyer Lansky was not in Havana on the night of January 1, 1959. But the news reached him with the same finality it reached everyone with significant stakes in the Cuban operation. Everything he had built over 20 years was gone, not damaged, not disrupted, gone. The new government had no interest in negotiating with the previous government's business partners. The casinos would be nationalized or shuttered. The political protection that had made the entire operation possible had evaporated with the man who had provided it. The estimated losses ran between $7 and $17 million. There was no legal recourse. You cannot sue a revolution. Lansky absorbed it and continued. This is, in some ways, the most revealing thing about him. Not the building, which required intelligence and patience and vision, but the absorbing. The capacity to sustain a loss of that magnitude and to redirect the organizational energy that had built Cuba into the next phase of operation without visible disruption. He moved resources. He restructured relationships. He redirected the financial architecture toward other jurisdictions, other opportunities, other political arrangements that might prove more durable, or at least more replaceable when they inevitably proved not to be. Cuba had taught him something that all his previous experience had suggested but never demonstrated so completely, that no political arrangement, however carefully constructed, was permanent, that the foundation of any operation built on the goodwill of a government was only as stable as that government. And governments, as history demonstrated with reliable frequency, were not stable. The lesson would inform everything that came after. The financial architecture that investigators spent the next 2 decades attempting to unravel. The Swiss accounts, the Bahamian intermediaries, the shell corporations and jurisdictions chosen for their legal opacity, reflected, in part, the Cuba experience. A system designed not just to be invisible but to be resilient, to survive the loss of any single node without collapsing. Lansky had gone to Cuba with a vision and $14 million. He had left with something more valuable than either. The Riviera still stands. It operated under the Cuban government for decades after the revolution. The building too beautiful and too structurally sound to demolish. The carpets were replaced. The chandeliers were cleaned. The dealers were trained by a different authority. Meyer Lansky never returned. What he had built there, the physical structure, the operational systems, the financial relationships, the 20 years of institutional knowledge, belonged to the revolution now. But what Cuba had built in him, the understanding of impermanence, the discipline of resilience, the recognition that the most durable thing a man in his position could construct was something that existed in no single place and could be claimed by no single government, that traveled with him. It could not be nationalized. It could not be seized. It could not be found in any casino cage or property deed or government registry. It was, like the best of what Lansky built, entirely invisible. And it was, of everything he carried out of Cuba on that January morning in 1959, the most valuable thing he owned.